Recently, Bungie announced that Divinity's bonus damage effect was getting buffed from 25% to 30%. I found this very confusing, as Divinity's bonus effect was already pretty good. But the caveat that came next was that Divinity's effect was not supposed to be stacking with other damage debuff effects. For example, Oppressive Darkness, which is a Season 8 mod where Void Grenades debuff a target. Other effects include things like Hammer Strike, Shattering Strike, Shadow Shot, and Tractor Cannon. Most of these have been normalized to a 30% debuff. Needless to say, this caused somewhat of an uproar in the community, so let's talk about this situation. First of all, if this was known to be a bug before this was announced, this information should have been known immediately. Within minutes of this weapon being found, it was pretty much known that it was stacking with other debuffs. If this was not intended and spoken about immediately, I don't think the outrage would have been as high, although I use the word outrage pretty loosely right now. I was very surprised that Divinity was a stacking debuff after all of the talk of buffs and debuffs no longer stacking in the insane ways that they were. Obviously, if we take a look at last year, things got out of hand in terms of buff and debuff stacking. Bungie is looking to probably avoid that, hence our current 1 debuff and 1 buff system. Thus, Divinity and other debuffs stacking immediately breaks any sort of rules that might have been set in place. So we're not off to a great start if we're trying to keep things in line. That being said, it is the raid exotic, and it would have stood out a bit more if you got to stack those debuffs. Divinity itself doesn't do a ton of damage, but it does more than what something like Banner Shield did in Year 2, which is provide a damage buff to the team at the cost of one person not being able to do any damage. This did provide a net gain in damage in a 6-man team, although it wasn't substantial enough that you felt weak without it. Divinity is the same concept, except it's a debuff instead of a buff, and you don't need to completely sacrifice all damage in order to use it. Not to mention, it makes it easier for your teammates to deal precision damage. But you can also live without having a Divinity. Although to its credit in being a difference maker pre-nerf, I think it is the difference maker between a 1 and 2 phase kill of a Garden of Salvation boss. In my flawless run, and also coincidentally for this video, we 1-cycled the Consecrated Mind because of Divinity, whereas if we don't use it, it is, most of the time anyway, a 2-cycle. In Season 8, Oppressive Darkness is the same effect. 30% damage debuff when you hit a target with a Void Grenade, and anyone can provide this. Thus, in the context of Season 8 alone, this makes it seem like Divinity will be useless. I don't know if I would say useless, but it will definitely take a diminished role in something like Garden of Salvation for the season, where it's relatively easy to chain grenades, although missing the crit spot on certain targets will be a sore spot for some. For boss damage, we have Shadow Shot. It costs you a super and the sacrificed damage from a Celestial Nighthawk shot, but you can still do damage while Shadow Shot is applied. Shadow Shot now also affects power weapons again. We still have Hammer and Shattering Strike along with Tractor Cannon, although in terms of their viability in Garden of Salvation, they're not as high. Tractor Cannon takes up a full weapon slot, and while that was fine in the auto reload days with Mountaintop, nowadays it's not as tempting. Melee-based debuffs are tougher to pull off in Garden compared to something like Last Wish, where they are very easy. So again, yes, Season 8 may see a decline in popularity for Divinity after it is nerfed. Divinity shines brightest in Master difficulty content, where applying debuffs to champions is much more valuable on a per enemy basis. Getting into melee range isn't really that viable, which leaves out the strikes and Tractor Cannon. While we have Oppressive Darkness in Season 8, in Season 9, that will go away, and it may not be replaced with an equal. And Shadow Shot is a super. You're not going to hit every single champion with a super. With Divinity, not only do you get a damage debuff, but you get a massive crit spot, which makes certain targets much more reliable to take down, namely Vex targets. This will continue to make Divinity a staple in Master difficulty content, assuming the difficulty of that content stays approximately the same between seasons. I think a lot of people are just looking at the fact that all of these debuffs are 30% damage, see Divinity is also 30% damage, and immediately think that it'll be garbage. Whereas in reality, you're not getting anywhere near an unstoppable ogre in a master level activity, and most debuffs either have a range of melee, require a super to use, or are seasonal. Accessibility is also part of the equation here, and that needs to be taken into account. There's no cooldown on Divinity. There's no power ammo needed for Divinity. And the crit spot is probably undervalued as well. Or maybe you just don't want to be forced into a Void subclass for Season 8. I think the main argument, or one of them anyway, that I've been seeing is that because it's a raid exotic and or difficult to get, that it should just be immune to the 1-in-1 rules that Bungie has put into play. And I would say that's a tough call because we then potentially get into a situation that resulted in Year 2 of Destiny, where everyone is just stomping over everything. I would say Year 3 of Destiny 2 is more about options rather than requirements, or rather than and. You can have Well of Radiance or a Ward of Dawn. You can have Divinity or a Tractor Cannon or Oppressive Darkness. The way I'm looking at the situation right now is how I looked at Lunafaction boots. Lunafactions, and to a lesser extent Rally Barricade, were more or less a necessity in Year 2 of Destiny 2. If you didn't have auto reload, just what were you doing, you know? Divinity would likely follow that same path of, alright, who's going to be our Divinity for this run, in the same vein as Well of Radiance was. It just so happens that running Divinity, in my opinion, is more fun than running Well of Radiance Lunafactions, and because it's still new, it doesn't have the same negative connotation as auto-reload Well of Radiance. I know people do not like being forced to do stuff or forced into a role in this game. I know people hate it. Divinity being able to stack with other debuffs is a move that more or less forces you to use it. The difference is that it's not class specific. That being said, the appeal of being well coordinated enough to one-cycle a boss is absolutely still appealing. If you're able to coordinate those debuffs and buffs accordingly, why shouldn't you be able to one-cycle a boss? It's a tough argument to counter because if you're skilled enough to make it happen, then there's a ton of merit to that. I'm not exactly talking about Riven, because with a lot of other fights you actually need to do a cycle of the fight first, but I digress. I don't think Divinity is dead in the water because of this nerf, but Season 8's seasonal mods will result in a lower use rate for Divinity when the nerf hits. Depending on what Season 9, 10, 11's mods are, I think Divinity will still be a high tier option for master level content for safe debuffing of enemies. Sure, if Season 9 has a different element grenade mod with the same effect, then maybe we have more of a problem. Again, Divinity is the only option for a near instant debuff that results in an easy crit spot. While the debuff doesn't last very long, it's still enough to get in the damage you need on targets like champions, and nothing else in the game provides that level of accessibility in master level content or any other content that people find challenging. Will I miss the extra boost from Divinity? Sure. Will I miss making a video 8 months later talking about how every encounter in the game now has to be balanced around Divinity and how the entire meta has revolved around it? Also, yes, because you guys watched that Well of Radiance video a lot and it brought in a lot of new subscribers and views. So on second thought, don't nerf it so I can get that YouTube ad revenue in a few months. That's all I got. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.